Today we're going to talk about game development tutorial dependence, how it happens, why it's a problem, things we can do about it. And broadly speaking, tutorial dependence is exactly what it sounds like. It's something where someone is at enough of a skill level to be able to follow tutorials, to not get lost in them, to be able to have enough of a setup to be able to use and deploy them, but dependent in so much as they've been unable to veer off of that track. They find themselves stuck in only doing exactly what's documented and then unable to go beyond that level. Basically unable to do original projects that finish. Now, occasionally there might still be a small game jam or something where basically they're taking a tutorial and then putting a spin on it, replacing some art or something of that sort. But this idea that how do we get off of that, again, quite literal dependence, and it's something which, and I don't mean this in any sort of accusatory way, I don't think it's deliberate, I don't think it's consciously going on, but there are people who are in the business of tutorials, making tutorials, selling tutorials, who, if their entire line of work is about making and selling tutorials, they are rewarded. Again, I'm not saying strategically they're trying to get people into it, but they're rewarded for tutorial dependence. They're rewarded for needing someone to be able to hand them the next model to follow, the next series of instructions. Whereas obviously, I think, as a trainer, certainly my goal is always how to get people off of that into where they can really build the things they want to build, original projects, where they can be going outside of exactly what they can find some template for. And so as far as how people fall into it, makes sense, right? I mean, you're trying to get started, and whatever your background might be, if it's into games, whether you've got a long programming background but you're new to games, whether you're new to programming and games, but you're kind of picking up both at once and the part of programming especially related to it, step one is often tutorials. And that makes sense. That's a perfectly good way to start. Let me be clear. This is in no way saying tutorials are bad. You shouldn't do tutorials. There shouldn't be tutorials. This is not anti-tutorial. This is about a problem of when, okay, one tutorial, good. Two tutorials, fine. Three tutorials, all right. And of course, if you're shifting to a new genre, if you're picking up a new particular skill that you're going to take back into other things, that's fine. But here's why it becomes a problem. It's not just a problem in the abstract. It's not just like a word for describing something that is, I'm saying is bad for its own sake. It's bad because it kills morale. It's bad because it derails why someone got into making games, because they had their ideas. Because there's things that they wanted to make and try and see and do and show and share and challenge themselves for, and they're not getting it if all they're doing is sort of this paint by the numbers stuff of typing exactly what they're told to type, exactly the way they're told to do it, building exactly what has been laid out before them. They probably got into it because they want to be explorers, and this is a little bit too much walking on the trail. Which, again, there's room for, especially if you're starting out. If you're new, by all means, stick to the safer trails. But the goal should be to get past that. The goal should be able to be building things that you have the idea, you drive the vision for it, you find ways to solve the problems you set up for yourself. But there's a lot of differences in terms of the types of questions you have to answer to do that. It's not just about, am I a good enough tutorial follower? Am I good enough at the very specific things that tutorials ask me to do? There's a whole set of skills that are missing between those, of how you plan out a project, of how you figure out what tasks need to be done in a way that necessarily, when you're being spoon-fed them in a tutorial context, you aren't doing. And so as an example of where I've tried to specifically bake into the tutorials that I make. So my course, one of them, how to program games on Udemy, taken by over 8,000 people. That course, based on the middle part of one of my textbooks. In the last whole chunk of that, right? So for the first part, it's exactly what you imagine for tutorial. Let's type this line. We're going to type this line together. I'm explaining to this line as I'm typing it. You type it too. Get it on your end. Make sure it's working. Okay, next section. Near the end, what I do is I shift away from write this line, here's how to do it. And instead, I start showing you, okay, part of the challenge of doing things on your own is filling in the gaps of picturing what are the intermediary steps. And what I mean by intermediary steps is, even if, like, let's say you've seen a house being built before. You've driven by a building under construction. And quite often, it can look from the outside like it's done. But they're not letting anybody in there for like a year because it's not. Because the intermediary step is very different in terms of the framework, the electrical, the plumbing. How it's supposed to look at 25% through is different than it's not just the bottom 25% of a house. And the same is true for game development, where quite often what's happening is we get from point A to point B by picturing what the lily pads, what the stepping stones look like from where we are to how it needs to get. And so what I do near the end of that course is, instead of giving you line by line, I first, to try to wean you off of it, show you the stepping stones. I say, okay, the program did this. Now, without showing you the code, here's what to look on screen next. We're trying to make the following change to it. Based on what you've learned so far in this tutorial, you know everything you should by now to be able to identify the micro tasks necessary to get from stepping stone 1 to stepping stone 2, stepping stone 2 to stepping stone 3, that then builds us towards a whole different type of game built on the same general framework of ideas. This also is necessarily built into it in a way that sometimes gets lost in tutorials. There are pros and cons in fields and disciplines that academic approaches to things are better or worse for. One thing that it does well that occasionally gets lost in the tutorial realm, which is largely non-academic, often self-taught, practical, functionally focused, is this very notion of teaching you something to then challenge and test you to apply it. That's built into academia in part because they often have the advantage of someone who's able to help you if you get stuck, to follow you what you're doing, to pay attention to it, to be able to help guide or advise you, to be able to basically also help evaluate the output. One of the things that gets lost sometimes in a written or video tutorial is that, obviously, if you steer them too far off the rails, you can't pull them back on. So the compromise I use in that second tutorial, what I do there is I include an example solution of how I did that step in the downloads, but again, not part of the main tutorial. It's literally, if you get stuck, look at this code. Otherwise, by this point in the course, my hope is you won't have to. Or at the very least, the other way that traditionally things are taught in a more conventional curriculum is look at it when you get stuck, and you're going to learn much better. You're going to learn much more deeply, because what happens is until you've run into that problem, that barrier, that confusion of what you didn't know yet, the learning won't stick. It won't work. Because what happens is your brain thinks it doesn't have a question. If someone says, do you know this? You're like, yeah, I know it. Someone says, you know how to do this? You say, yeah, I know how to do this. When you try to do it, only then do you find the spot where you had an incorrect assumption, where you had, and it's not just about overconfidence, it's about genuinely, there's things that we are ready to do, and there's things that we think that we're ready to do. And part of what's great about what happens is that when we go through with the things that we think we're ready to do, we find out and can correct and fix the little bits and pieces that separate think we're ready to do it from actually ready to do it. Once it's behind us, we've demonstrated we can do that, we have the confidence, the outside world has the proof that we can do it. But that comes first and foremost from trying to do the thing with the training wheels off. To be told, okay, you know enough by now, based on exactly what based on recombinations of ideas you've been shown, this is the next natural step for you. This is also why it's really tough to build into traditional video type course scenarios or written tutorials, precisely because it requires a pretty clear understanding of what the person does and doesn't know yet. It needs to be built very closely on adjacent knowledge, on I know based on what we've covered in a sequential curriculum that you are ready to do this next thing. This actually was part of what butted me up against when I was putting courses on Udemy years ago, and it's part of where I haven't put more courses on Udemy. I wanted to build a sequence of curriculum. There's things you learn when you're starting out that are very fundamental and foundational. This is a lot of my pre-engine stuff. There's things that you then do next after you've done the very introductory stuff. That's why I have two different courses. One is Code Your First Game, is encouraged for absolutely starting out. It's also why it's free, because I know it's also for many people trying out, do they like this? Is this something they want to proceed forward on? The second course, How to Program Games, that includes my textbook, that includes the middle chunk of those chapters and the more advanced graphical concepts and tile-based collisions and so on, and actively weans you off of tutorial dependence near the end of it, is building on the assumption that you've already done the Code Your First Game course. They weren't really thrilled about the idea of me trying to encourage people to take in one course before another. It's not really what that kind of platform is built for. And there's other things. This platform is an ideal thing for us. It's not a fault of theirs necessarily. It was simply a mismatch of how I feel teaching ought to be done for the particular things that I teach and the way that they like to corral their customers, their students on that particular platform. And so this is where the next natural step after that. This is why we then tend to move people past that at that stage, is because, again, there's a morale problem to be considered in tutorial dependence. That about that point, the projects are reaching a level of sophistication and complexity that if all you're doing is tutorials, it's a lot of time to sink into the output you get for you having so little creative involvement in it, for you not getting to be the game director, for you not getting to have much say in which features to add or how, in part because the moment that you do, you run into questions that there is no way the tutorial could have answered, because they're driven by the path you want to lead instead. They're where you want to go. And this is why, at a very fundamental level, Home Team Game Dev exists. You probably figure this is coming, as this is a large part of why we do what we do. And to be clear, this is not something where it's like, oh, here's what I do, how do I go out there and convince people it's a good idea? I'm doing what I'm doing in the way that I'm doing because the past 16 years of leading people into game development have led me to understand that this is the way to do it. That precisely that it gives people the freedom and flexibility to, they can venture off on their own, they can take on original projects, they have the support of teammates so more gets done in less time, they're learning from encountering the challenges that interest them, they have the motivation of releasing things that they wanted to build, they got to try out their ideas, right or wrong, right? The ideas we have aren't always the best, but the way we learn to improve them is by getting them out of us, by doing something with them, by attempting it. And that's where, think about the difference between, there's a trail to follow, right? That's a tutorial. And then there's just the jungle. Where you just get out there. You just wander just straight into the trees and hope nothing bites you and hope you don't get poisoned and, a lot of stuff happening. Somewhere in the middle is having a tour guide. Somewhere in the middle is somebody who knows that terrain well. Somebody who's able to help reorient you if you get lost. Someone who's able to answer questions about, is this safe to eat? That's what I do. That's what Home Team is. That's why I meet with our leads. That's why I meet with other members who have questions. That's why we have support trainers. It's fundamentally somewhere between the trails that are tutorials and just wandering off into the jungle, where when people do that in game development, it also drains the morale, but for different reasons. Because unlike tutorial dependence, which tends to drain morale because they're not getting to do their ideas their way, actually, this may be more related than I thought it is. In the case of people who go straight into the jungle, of trying to do commercial games, solo or otherwise, or without some sort of decent framework or support, in those cases, their morale gets damaged because years pass and they're not seeing progress, or they're finding themselves stuck, or they're unable to adapt solutions they find outside into the things that they are trying to do. And once again, they're not getting to see their ideas to fruition because they're having to give up and bail too often on what they wanted to try to do. This is where, within Home Team, what myself and our other mentors do is specifically help people do the things that they mean to do the way they mean to do them. They have a vision for what they want to build. They need a little bit of occasional help to course correct, but they also don't need constant hand-holding of a tutorial. Because constant hand-holding is not the point. It's not what's best for them. Part of why I've moved away from one-on-one training, and I still do a bit of it. There's probably about a half a dozen clients, and there's particular reasons why their projects are particularly ambitious. There's cases where the client might be specifically very young. There's cases where someone's so strapped on time, they only have like 1 hour every other month, for example, and they're trying to get maximum output out of that. So there's situations where it fits. But for the most part of why I've moved away from that into this other approach is precisely because it better builds independence. Which again is going to sound weird when someone thinks about the fact that what I do is I support people actively as my profession, but the goal is not to make them need me. And that's where when I largely just met with people weekly, there's a lot of people who would only get things done when they met with me, who were doing things that could have and should have been done between sessions, and they would learn more if they did and they could. And so that's where part of what's great about this approach of the supported framework of peers in Home Team is that people take on original projects with ambitious ideas, doing the things that they want to do the way they want to do them, knowing that I'm there as a safety net. And this is very different from an arranged, think like a piano lessons kind of structure, which is what I used to do and still do about half a dozen clients with private game development, one-on-one, is that when you know there's a session coming up, well then, okay, you count on you'll get it done during that time. When it's there to schedule if you need it, well, an interesting thing happens. It allows you to take on problems knowing that if you get stuck, you can get bailed out. And often you don't need to get bailed out. Simply knowing you have that safety net there, someone to turn to who can and will absolutely some gradient of give you hints if you want hints, fix it for you if you're super stuck, and anywhere in between, point you towards code that's an example solution somewhere else, or someone else has solved this problem that they know from their experience, my experience, is relevant to your particular use case and situation from a higher level. Knowing that enables you to take on the bigger projects, enables you to take on more custom solutions, doing things the way you want to do them, break free of tutorial dependence. And so it's why even though there's out of our nearly 100 HomeTeamGameDev.com projects we've released, out of those, a few of them, especially the ones that someone's first pitch, second pitch, or first pitch in a platform, first time in JS, first time in Unity. Sometimes they build off one of our tutorials and then run from there, but they're still taking it much further than it would have gone. They're taking it much different directions than we would have led them down, in a way that no tutorial could have fit their personal identity, their personal expression, their personal interest in this genre, this particular project. And then very quickly, the second project lead, third project lead, fourth project lead, fifth project lead, we've had 5x multiple time project leads, get more and more far from what any tutorial could have been written to done, because they're making it matter that it's them doing it. They're making it matter that it's their ideas. In a way that I think gets missed sometimes, that even when somebody is in industry, at the top of their craft, being incredibly well paid, making games that tons of players play, they don't even have that freedom to just do whatever they feel like doing. They have executives to answer to, funders to answer to, customers to answer to. When you're doing freeware, you actually have, in many cases, as long as you're keeping costs affordable, the arbitrary freedom to make what you want to make. In a way that I think, again, gets overlooked. Because it will say, oh, if I only had more budget, if only I had more funding, if only I had more financial support and resources to make this happen. All of those come with strings attached about people who are holding accountable. Are you going to earn back at least that much? And you lose a lot of the same creative freedom that you get if you're just wandering, if you're just exploring. Right? I mean, picture we go back to our trails as tutorial dependence. We go back to our wandering into the jungle and then losing all your life savings and dying from an alligator eating you. And somewhere in the middle of this, there's the tour guide. Well, there's also the thing of like, okay, well, you know, if I just, I don't know, if I got like a whole convoy of vehicles out there, then it'd be safer and it'd be easier. But yeah, but if you're gonna drum up that amount of resources, now you've got a lot of people to answer to. There's a lot of people who want to know where you're getting. And at that point, you're doing a very different kind of thing than whatever the heck you feel like. Wandering where your whims take you. Doing what interests you. Following through on your ideas. Testing your ideas. Not because you think they're ideal, but because through the testing and use of your ideas, you get a clear picture of what you're sinking, what you're floating, what you can learn from going forward, and allows you to take on this bigger perspective of, essentially at some level, tutorializing yourself, of building the games that you want to build as a part of teaching yourself the skills you want to build, so that, as you continue to ratchet up in complexity of what you're doing, you're building on personal hooks. Not something you heard in a tutorial somewhere, not something you read on a website somewhere, but your past experiences releasing projects, your past experiences finishing similar problems. And this is where the same thing, we talked about these middle steps, these stepping stones. And with my private training clients, in a way that we've kind of baked back into the approach that I advise many of our members on when they meet with me for office hours and home team, a big part of the question is, okay, there's a certain kind of game you want to make. There's a certain thing that you want to do. Well, if we start it right now, it's going to be just full of it's just totally polluted with beginner errors. There's going to be a ton of things that you're going to wince about. They're going to be duct tape and stapled together that you're going to look at and say, I wish I should have done it a different way. Because you don't have experience in the related fields. So what we instead do is we break down, we fragment it. We look at, okay, here's the game that's going to involve pathfinding. It's going to involve some relatively sophisticated UI. It's going to involve some various kinds of, I don't know, real-time AI. It's going to involve some inventory system. Maybe we throw in there a big custom map structure, etc. Okay, well, you make some smaller projects with lower risk, lower personal investment, lower time sank into it. 6 weekers, 2 monthers, 3 months in some cases. And then we look at, or in the case of Home Team, someone else's project. How can we practice these areas that interest you in something of lower risk that's still going to get finished? Because the morale also takes a hit if you sink work into something and it goes nowhere and never gets released and isn't finished and you can't point to it and you have no hindsight to learn from. But we look at how can we make it so by the time you're doing something on a project that matters to you, that's invested in, that's a 6 month of your life kind of project scale, that you care about the output because it's an important project to you, how can we make it so that then that's not your first time doing any major problem in it? It's your second, third draft at those. So you're able to draw upon your past solutions and equally importantly draw upon the wincing in hindsight of, ooh, here's how I should have done that, now that I look back on it. And that's where the experience starts paying off and again taking us even further away from, even then there's sort of this invisible tutorial ramp we're building ourselves of practicing those skills, but it's off the beaten path. It's the smaller trails with a guide, and then we start moving our way towards your personal Everest, if you will, or whatever your goals might be in terms of things you want to build that are important to you. How do we prepare you for that so that even if you still have a guide with you some of that time, or maybe you don't, you're adequately prepared, and you're not just going into it with needless risk. There's a whole bunch of issues people complain about with game development, about it being lonely, about it being risky, about it being confusing, about it being frustrating, but it doesn't have to be any of those things if it's done right, which is why we structured Home Team the way we did, to help wean people from tutorial dependence into tutorial independence very early on in that pathway. Basically 1.5 courses. Even my second course, I'll tell you what, out of that second course, How to Program Games, and it's got the full textbook of 550-page color stuff and example source code for 6 different genres, a lot of our very successful project leads don't finish that second course. They get about halfway through it. They don't do the 100 exercises in the back of the book. They might do 10, 15, 20 of them. Because what's happening is, those are exercises, and the rest of that course are there for if what you don't have to turn to is a human being to help you have the flexibility to carry those skills forward in a way that interests you and speaks to your specific creative visions. If you do, and that's definitely a better, faster way to learn, to get results, to get a path that better fits and suits you. Those are there for the folks who are only taking that course, will never be a part of Home Team because, well, maybe they choose not to. But again, the goal is as soon as we can, how do we get you off tutorials into building things that you want to build, to learn things you want to learn, make stuff you want to make, and then building up just a string of projects behind you that show to the outside world and to yourself what you're capable of, how much you've improved, the things you're able to do, the things you've done. And that's why we do Home Team the way we do, helping people off of that tutorial dependence. That's it for the day. Thanks for being here. If you're interested in joining us, you can apply at hometeamgamedev.com. It's particularly a great time to apply. We're actually in the middle of 5 consecutive weeks releasing games from Home Team Apollo Group. One was also from Outpost Group. Several good projects going in Outpost. We just had a new pitch of Unity 3D project in Apollo. Probably a 1 to 2 month time frame still if you apply now to join. Any given day that might shift to a longer wait, depending on when or if we get coverage elsewhere. So, good day to apply. And of course, costs nothing to apply, and still up to you whether or not you join when you get accepted. So hometeamgamedev.com, find out more there, and apply. Bye for now.